The normally quiet Chicago Union Station was now bustling with people as Thanksgiving approached. Travelers hurried through the Grand Hall, some lugging heavy suitcases, others clutching paper coffee cups as they waited for their departures. Long lines stretched before the ticket booths, and among the eager passengers stood James Miller, a silver-haired man in his late 70s. His face glowed with quiet excitement, his wrinkled hands tucked neatly into the pockets of his wool coat. James was on his way to New York City, where his son, David Miller, lived. It had been months since he last saw his family, and he could barely contain his anticipation. "I wonder what Michelle has prepared this time," he muttered under his breath, thinking about his daughter-in-law's famous holiday dishes. "She always tries something new every year." His lips curled into a small smile as he imagined his grandson, Jake, now a teenager, greeting him at the door. The line moved slowly, but James didn't mind. He adjusted the small leather bag strapped around his waist and tapped his foot in rhythm with the soft background music playing through the station's speakers. He was lost in thought, picturing his family's warm apartment in Manhattan, when suddenly his heart pounded as he instinctively reached for the zipper of his bag and unfastened it in a rush. His fingers fumbled through its compartments, his breath growing shallow. "No, no, no," he murmured, his voice barely above a whisper. His wallet was gone. A cold sweat formed on his forehead. He patted his coat pockets, checked his back pockets, even looked inside his duffel bag, nothing. His hands trembled. The weight of panic pressed against his chest. Behind him, the impatient sighs of other passengers became louder. Someone cleared their throat pointedly. The ticket booth attendant, a young man with slick-back hair and a bored expression, looked up from a screen. "Sir, we've got a line here. Do you have your payment ready?" James swallowed hard. He looked around, his head spinning. Had he dropped it in the restroom earlier? Maybe near the waiting area? His mind raced. And then, a soft voice interrupted his turmoil. "Excuse me, sir, do you need some help?" He turned his head and saw a young woman standing beside him. She had dark brown hair neatly pulled into a ponytail and was dressed in a simple yet professional-looking coat. Her eyes were warm and filled with concern. "My name is Emily Collins. I'm a nursing student at NYU. I couldn't help but notice. Are you missing something?" James hesitated. He felt embarrassed, exposed, as if the whole station were watching him. I seem to have lost my wallet," he admitted, his voice shaky. Emily offered him a gentle smile. "Would it be okay if I covered your ticket?" James blinked, taken aback. "Oh, no, I couldn't possibly let you do that," he said, shaking his head. Emily, however, simply took out her credit card and turned to the attendant. "One ticket to New York, please," she said with quiet confidence. The ticket booth worker, who had been tapping his fingers on the desk impatiently, wordlessly processed the transaction. The printer whirred, and within seconds, Emily was holding out the ticket to James. He hesitated, his pride battling against his gratitude. "I don't even know how to thank you," he murmured, finally taking the ticket. Emily chuckled. "You don't have to. It's Thanksgiving. I'd hate for you to miss seeing your family over something like this." James let out a deep sigh, a mix of relief and gratitude washing over him. "You're very kind, Miss Collins. I promise I'll repay you." "Don't worry about it," she replied with a smile. "Besides, I'm taking the same bus. We might as well keep each other company." At that moment, something inside James softened. Maybe losing his wallet hadn't been entirely unlucky after all. The waiting area was still packed, but James and Emily found 2 seats beside each other. The metal chairs were cold against the back of his coat, but the warmth of conversation quickly erased the discomfort. "You said you're a nursing student?" James asked, settling into his seat. Emily nodded. "Yeah, I'm in my final year at NYU's nursing program. I'm currently finishing my clinical rotations. James raised his eyebrows, impressed. That's no easy feat. I imagine you're quite busy with all that. She laughed lightly, tucking a loose strand of hair behind her ear. That's an understatement. Between studying for my licensing exam and applying for jobs, I barely have time to breathe. But I love it. Taking care of patients. It's what I've always wanted to do. James listened intently. There was something refreshing about talking to someone with such genuine passion for their work. You remind me of my son, he said after a pause. He's a doctor. A plastic surgeon, actually. Runs his own practice in Manhattan. Emily's eyes widened slightly. Wow, that's amazing. He must have worked really hard to get there. James nodded proudly. Ever since he was a boy, he wanted to be a doctor. I still remember him staying up late, reading medical textbooks he was way too young to understand. He chuckled at the memory. And now, here he is, running one of the top clinics in the city. Emily smiled warmly. He sounds like someone really dedicated to his craft. James looked at her thoughtfully. I bet you two would get along. You seem to have the same drive. She laughed. Maybe. The medical field is small, you never know. The bus finally arrived, and the station staff began calling out boarding announcements. Emily and James rose from their seats, grabbing their bags. Would you like to sit together? James asked hesitantly. Emily beamed. I'd love that. As they settled into their seats, the chill of the evening air was soon replaced by the comfortable warmth of the bus interior. Through the window, Chicago's city lights flickered against the darkening sky. As the vehicle rumbled forward, the two continued their conversation, their words weaving a bridge between generations. Neither of them realized just how life-changing this journey would be. The bus hummed steadily along the highway, its overhead lights dimmed for the long overnight journey. Most passengers were settling into quiet conversations, reading, or slipping on headphones to drown out the gentle rumble of the engine. James shifted slightly in his seat, adjusting his jacket for warmth. Beside him, Emily tucked her hands into the sleeves of her sweater, the cool night air still lingering in her fingertips. James said, glancing over at her, I always thought young people these days were too caught up in their own lives to notice when someone else needed help. You've proven me wrong tonight. Emily tilted her head, giving him a thoughtful smile. I don't think kindness is as rare as people say. It just doesn't always get noticed. She paused before adding, Besides, you remind me of my grandfather. He passed away a few years ago, but he was the kindest man I ever knew. If he had been in trouble, I'd hope someone would have done the same for him. James was quiet for a moment, letting her words settle. He must have been a good man. The best, she nodded. He used to say, no act of kindness is ever too small. I try to live by that. James let out a soft chuckle. That's a lesson even us old folks could stand to remember. Outside, the city lights of Chicago faded behind them, replaced by the vast darkness of the Midwest night. You mentioned your son runs a plastic surgery practice in Manhattan? Emily asked, turning slightly toward James. That's right, he said, his voice tinged with pride. David always had a sharp mind. Even as a kid, he was fascinated by medicine. When he was 5, he'd wrap his teddy bear in bandages and pretend to perform surgery. My wife and I always knew he was meant for something big. Emily laughed. Sounds like he was born to be a doctor. James nodded. It wasn't easy for him, though. He came from a working-class family. I was a factory worker most of my life, and my wife was a school teacher. We didn't have the kind of money that made medical school an easy dream. But David was relentless. He studied on scholarships, worked part-time jobs. He never complained, just kept pushing forward. Emily's admiration grew with each word. That's really inspiring. My parents are teachers too. I know how hard it can be to pay for college. James looked at her, interest flickering in his eyes. So, what made you choose nursing? She hesitated, then said, When I was 16, my mom was diagnosed with cancer. She went through months of treatments, and the nurses who took care of her, they weren't just medical staff. They were emotional support, the people who made sure she wasn't just another patient in a hospital bed. She exhaled softly. I saw how much of a difference they made in her life, in our whole family's life. That's when I knew I wanted to be that person for someone else. James sat back, nodding. That takes a special kind of strength, Emily. She offered a small smile. I like to think my mom would be proud. The bus rumbled on, the hum of the tires against the road providing a steady rhythm. For a moment, they sat in comfortable silence, each lost in thought. Do you think your wallet was stolen? Emily asked after a while. James sighed. I'd like to believe I just dropped it somewhere. Maybe in the restroom at the station. He ran a hand through his silver hair. It's not the cash I'm worried about. It's my ID, my credit cards, just a hassle to replace. You should cancel your cards as soon as we get to New York, Emily suggested. I can help you with that if you'd like. James chuckled. I swear, you're a guardian angel in disguise. She grinned. Nah, just a nursing student who's good at fixing problems. 8:45. As the night stretched on, their conversation deepened. James shared stories of his youth, how he met his late wife, the years they spent raising David, and the sacrifices they made to give him the best education possible. Emily, in turn, talked about her struggles with balancing school, part-time jobs, and preparing for her nursing board exams. At some point, James found himself saying, You know, I'd love for David to meet you. He always talks about how finding good nurses is harder than finding good doctors. Emily laughed. Well, if he's hiring, tell him to give me a call after I pass my boards. James smiled. Don't be surprised if he actually does. The bus continued its journey through the night, carrying with it two unlikely companions who, by pure chance, had crossed paths in the most unexpected of ways. As dawn approached, the bus neared the outskirts of New York City. The darkened skyline began to glow with the soft hues of early morning. Streetlights flickered as the city slowly woke up, the first signs of life appearing on the streets. James stirred in his seat, stretching his stiff legs as he peered out the window. There it is, he murmured, spotting the familiar sight of the Manhattan skyline. Emily, rubbing her eyes, followed his gaze. Still as breathtaking as ever, she said with a yawn. You don't live here, do you? James asked. Emily shook her head. I live in Brooklyn. Cheaper rent and more space than Manhattan, but my classes and clinicals are mostly in the city, so I'm here all the time. James smiled. Smart choice. Back when I was young, rent in Manhattan wasn't so bad. Now, even doctors complain about it. Speaking of doctors, Emily said, turning to him, what's your son like? Aside from being an incredibly hard worker, of course. James chuckled. David? Well, let's see. He's stubborn, I'll tell you that much. Always had to be the best at whatever he did. He's got a sharp mind, a sharp tongue, and a heart that's bigger than he lets on. Emily raised an eyebrow. Sounds intense. Oh, he is, James nodded. But he's also one of the most compassionate people I know. He wouldn't have made it as a surgeon if he weren't. He genuinely cares about his patients, even if he's too busy to show it sometimes. Emily smiled. That's the kind of doctor I'd want to work with. James studied her for a moment before a twinkle appeared in his eyes. You know, his practice is actually looking for new nurses. Emily laughed. Well, if I ace my licensing exam, maybe I'll consider it. James grinned. I'll make sure to put in a good word. The bus slowed as it approached Port Authority Bus Terminal, the largest and busiest transit hub in the city. The speaker crackled as the driver announced their arrival. Around them, passengers stirred awake, grabbing their bags and preparing to disembark. James and Emily stepped onto the sidewalk, greeted by the unmistakable scent of freshly brewed coffee and taxi exhaust, a true New York welcome. "So, how are you getting to your son's place?" Emily asked. He's picking me up," James said, pulling out his phone. "Should be here any minute." As if on cue, a sleek black Mercedes-Benz pulled up at the curb. A tall man in his late 30s stepped out, his tailored coat falling perfectly over his crisp dress shirt. He had sharp, intelligent eyes and an air of quiet authority. Emily immediately recognized the look of a professional, efficient, well-dressed, and slightly exhausted. James beamed. "There he is. David." David Miller strode forward, his eyes instantly softening when he saw his father. "Dad," he said, wrapping him in a firm hug. "You look good." James patted his back. "Of course I do. I had a guardian angel looking out for me." David pulled back, his brows furrowing. "What do you mean?" James gestured toward Emily. "This young lady saved my trip. I lost my wallet at the station, and she bought my bus ticket. Wouldn't even let me pay her back." David turned to Emily, his sharp gaze assessing her for a moment before he extended a hand. "David Miller, thank you for helping my father." Emily shook his hand, surprised by his directness. "Emily Collins. It was no trouble at all." James smirked. "She's being modest. She even offered to help me cancel my credit cards." David's expression softened slightly. "That was very kind of you." Emily shrugged. "I just did what anyone should." David's eyes flickered with interest. "My father mentioned you're a nursing student." Emily nodded. "Yes, sir. Final year at NYU." A knowing look passed over David's face. "Interesting." James, sensing something between them, clapped his hands together. "Well, I'm starving. Any chance breakfast is on the table?" David chuckled. "Of course. Mom, Michelle made pancakes, eggs, the whole deal." James turned to Emily. "You have time for breakfast? You've already done so much. I'd love for you to meet the rest of the family." Emily hesitated. "Oh, I wouldn't want to intrude," David cut in. "It's not an intrusion. Consider it a thank you meal." After a moment's thought, Emily smiled. "Well, I can't say no to pancakes." With that, she climbed into the back seat, unknowingly stepping further into a world that would change her life forever. The drive through Manhattan was a blend of morning hustle and classic city charm. Pedestrians rushed past coffee carts, yellow taxis honked impatiently, and the towering glass buildings shimmered in the soft sunlight. Emily sat in the back seat of David's sleek Mercedes, feeling slightly out of place. "So, how did you two end up sitting together?" David asked, glancing in the rearview mirror at Emily. "Your dad invited me to sit with him," she replied, smiling. "We had a great conversation." James chuckled. "Told her all about you. You should have heard me bragging." David shook his head, but there was warmth behind his exasperation. "I can only imagine." Soon, they pulled up to a high-rise apartment building in the Upper East Side. A doorman greeted them with a polite nod as they stepped inside. The elevator ride was smooth, silent. Emily felt the quiet weight of expensive luxury all around her. When the doors opened to the Miller family apartment, Emily's eyes widened. The space was stunning, modern yet welcoming. Large windows showcased the city skyline, and the smell of freshly brewed coffee and maple syrup drifted through the air. "Wow," she murmured. A woman in her early 40s emerged from the kitchen, wiping her hands on a towel. Her brown hair was tied back, and she had the polished, effortless elegance of someone who belonged in a magazine. Michelle, James greeted, stepping forward to embrace his daughter-in-law.
James.
You made it, she said warmly before noticing Emily. And who's this? This, James said proudly, is Emily Collins, the wonderful young lady who made sure I got here this morning. Michelle's eyes softened as she extended a hand. It's a pleasure to meet you, Emily. Any friend of James is welcome here. Emily shook her hand. It's really nice to meet you, Mrs. Miller. Thanks for letting me crash your breakfast. Nonsense, we're happy to have you. Come in, sit down. The breakfast spread was nothing short of impressive. Fluffy pancakes, crispy bacon, scrambled eggs, fresh fruit, and steaming cups of coffee. Emily hesitated for a moment before sitting between James and David. She still felt a little out of place, but the warmth of the Millers made it easier. So, Emily, Michelle said, pouring her some coffee, James tells me you're studying nursing at NYU? Yes, ma'am. Final year, Emily said, stirring her coffee. That's wonderful. Do you know where you want to work after graduation? Still figuring that out, Emily admitted. Right now, I'm focused on my licensing exam. David, who had been silent for most of breakfast, suddenly spoke. We're actually looking for new nurses at my practice. Emily blinked, surprised. Oh, he nodded. Finding skilled nurses is easy. Finding compassionate ones? Not so much. There was something almost unreadable in his expression. Analyzing, considering. James leaned back with a satisfied smirk. Told you she'd be a perfect fit. Emily's eyes widened slightly. Wait, are you offering me a job? David took a sip of his coffee. I'm offering you an interview. You've already proven something that matters more than any degree. You care about people. That's what I look for in my staff. Emily hesitated.
Wow.
I wasn't expecting that. You don't have to decide now, David added. But think about it. From what my father says, you're exactly the kind of nurse I want on my team. James patted her shoulder.
See?
Told you this trip would change your life. After breakfast, Emily stood near the window, looking out at the city. The morning light reflected off the buildings, bathing everything in a golden glow. Michelle joined her, holding a fresh cup of coffee. David can be a little intense, but he's a great doctor. And if he thinks you'd be a good fit, he means it. Emily smiled. It's just a lot to take in. A few hours ago, I was just trying to help a stranger buy a bus ticket. Now, I might have a job offer from one of the top surgeons in Manhattan. Michelle laughed. Funny how life works, isn't it? Emily nodded, exhaling slowly. As she turned, she caught David watching her from across the room. He gave her a small nod, a silent acknowledgement, a hint of something unspoken. Maybe James was right. Maybe this was the beginning of something life-changing. Emily walked through the glass doors of Miller Aesthetic and Reconstructive Surgery, the prestigious clinic David Miller owned in Manhattan. She had taken some time to think, but in the end, fate had already decided for her. As she checked in at the front desk, a familiar voice called out, Emily. She turned to see David approaching, dressed in his pristine white coat, his expression unreadable as always. Welcome to the team. A slow smile spread across Emily's face. Thank you, Dr. Miller. I won't let you down. David studied her for a moment before replying. I don't think you will.